was that one of the things we need to do is, fostering data protection awareness and training. For entities especially, because entities are the most susceptible just because they handle very, very huge amounts of data. And because their employees are very, very many for some of those organizations anyway, the probability that there'll be a lapse or there'll be a gap in terms of data protection is larger than perhaps smaller entities. And so what they need to do is, one, educate employees, customers, and partners about the importance of data protection or data privacy. They also need to educate them about the importance of safe data handling practices and compliance, because compliance is a huge thing. More specifically, even if we brought it down to the country's level, where the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner has made it mandatory for organizations that are collecting personal information and which meet certain thresholds to register with them, just because if there are any data breaches or if there are any data leaks, then the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner needs to know that, we can come back to this individual and we can ask them, by the way, what are some of the measures or what are some of the steps that you've taken to ensure that you are now, that this information that you've collected is not at risk. And something else that you also need to do as an organization is, teach people on how to avoid common cyber threats, things like phishing or ransomware attacks. I know a good number of employees are very, very, they do not necessarily have the knowledge to decipher between what emails are good and what emails are not good, because some of those emails that come through your spam folder will likely be attempts at phishing. And so if you click on certain links, what that ends up doing is that it might prevent all sorts of risks, including downloading malware, you giving out your personal information, which can then be used against you in future. So it's very, very critical that any organization that collects or that processes vast amounts of information teach their employees or their staff on how to decipher between emails that don't necessarily present any risks and those that are aimed at phishing or any other malicious intents. Second thing that perhaps organizations can do is that they can adopt comprehensive data privacy policies. So sometimes it's not just about writing down those policies or having them written down by a data protection expert. Sometimes it is simply about their usage. So how do you then enforce the contents of whatever policies have been written? So do you have your employees been trained on how they collect it, how they use this data, how they store this data, and how all these steps are then in compliance with local and international laws? Because if you are transferring data outside the country, then there needs to be some sort of adherence to the law, or there needs to be compliance with the law, whether it's in terms of getting consent from the data subject, or whether it is ensuring that this country where you are transferring this data also has some level of data protection, some level of data protection compliance in terms of the laws that they have, in terms of the regulations that they have. Something else that perhaps can be done is regular security audits and risk assessment. So these ones are probably best done by cybersecurity experts, just because there might be a technical aspect to it. So these ones will assess what is your risk vulnerability and ensure that if there's anything technical that needs to be done, whether it is encryption, whether it is securing your systems with anti-malware, that these ones are also implemented. And as I said, the last point will probably be tied to that point of implementing strong encryption, because encrypting sensitive data both at rest and in transit is necessary for the protection against unauthorized access, and that will ensure that even if data is intercepted, it remains secure and unreadable, so that there's a lesser risk of this data being extracted if it is. And so what does protecting your data, at least as per the data protection laws, look like in today's world? One of the things that is very, very critical and has contained in the Data Protection Act is the concept of the data protection principles. And so whenever an entity or an organization is collecting data or is collecting information, it needs to comply with specific standards, or it needs to comply with what are termed to as data protection principles. So some of the principles include, one, the principle of lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. And under this principle, personal data cannot be, or rather, personal data should be processed lawfully, fairly, and in a transparent manner in relation to the data subject. This just means that whenever you are processing any information, and so processing as a term can mean quite a number of things, including all the procedures from starting from collection, how you store this data, um, how you assess or how you process, how you analyze this data, and how you perhaps even transfer it. So that is the range of activities that can probably fall under the processing. So if you're doing any of these things, then it is very, very critical that the subject or the individual from whom you are collecting this data understands why you are collecting their data, because you can't just come to an individual, take their data, and you do not inform them why you are collecting this data. More importantly, it should also be a lawful purpose. You cannot collect data for unlawful purposes. You cannot collect data for you to defraud or for you to purport to take on another individual's identity, which you refer to as identity theft. So the process not only has to be transparent in terms of you informing the data subject what their data is being collected for, but it also has to be lawful and be within the confines of the law. The second principle is on purpose limitation. And on purpose limitation, the premise here is that personal data shall be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes, and not further processed in a manner that is not compatible with these purposes. So what this means is that under purpose limitation, the requirement is that if, say, for instance, you approach an individual, a good case example, a good case study would be perhaps in the insurance industry. If, say, for instance, you approach an individual and you are an insurance salesperson, and you told this individual that, by the way, please provide me with XYZ details about you so that I may be able to provide you or to offer you health insurance, for instance. You cannot use the same data to offer them another form of insurance, say, for instance, general or motor vehicle. It has to be confined. The information that you collected in the first instance has to be confined to the purpose that you told them, so that if you're coming to me and you're telling me, please provide me with your email, your number, and any other details so that I can offer you health insurance, you cannot then send me a flyer or a brochure for motor vehicle insurance or for general insurance or for life policy. You cannot do that, because these purposes are the purposes that the purposes that you're using my data for are not the same ones that you alluded to when you are collecting my information. If you want to provide me with any other form of insurance, then you have to come to me and tell me that, by the way, either you collect my data afresh, or you tell me that you also need to use my data for other purposes, such as offering me motor vehicle, life policy, or any other form of insurance other than what was alluded to in the first instance. That is the principle of purpose limitation. On data minimization, which is another principle, this one requires that any data that is collected should only be adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary in relation to the purpose for which it is processed. So this means that if you are collecting information, if you're collecting personal information, the principle of data minimization requires that you do not collect more information than you need. So say, for instance, again, going back to the concept of provision of insurance, if you do not need to know a person's next of kin, or if you don't need to know their blood type, for instance. So say, for instance, you want to offer me motor vehicle insurance, and you're coming and asking me for what is my blood type or anything else that is related to my health status, then these two things are not compatible. The data you are collecting and what you are using it for is in excess. The data you're collecting is in excess of what you need it for. So that means that if you need, for instance, 2 or 3 or 4 data sets for you to offer me a service, then you do not need to collect 5 or 6. The 3 or 4 should be enough. On accuracy, this just means that whatever information you've collected or you have about an individual should be accurate, and when necessary should be kept up to date. Again, going back to the Access to Information Act, which allows you as an individual to request that any data that may be false or misleading about you by a state agency to be corrected. This is in and along the same lines, so that if, say, for instance, you've updated your physical address, you've updated your phone number, you've updated your name, for instance, has changed, then you are the entity that has any information about you is required to sort of ensure that the information that they have and the information that is actually factual align in that regard. On storage limitation, personal data shall be kept in a form which permits identification of the for no longer than is necessary. Which means that if you've been contracting with an agency or with an organization or with an entity, and it gets to a point where you no longer need their services or where you no longer want to be engaged with them, then they should not keep this data about you, unless, of course, there are other laws that then mandate them to keep that particular information. Because, for instance, I know that in Kenya, any employee information or any tax information can be kept up to a period of about 7 years. But beyond that, or even during that period, this is not information that should be in the public domain. It is information that should, at the very, very least, be anonymized so that nobody can come and this is information belonging to individual X, and you've since ceased to be either an employee of that particular organization, if you are indeed an employee, or you are no longer contracting their services. If, say, for instance, again, going back to the example that I gave of insurance, if you are subscribing to, I don't know, Jubilee Insurance, and you decided that you no longer want to be their customer and you terminate a policy or something of that sort, then it is Jubilee's mandate to delete any information that they have of you, and to only keep information that would be necessary for them to comply with any other laws that are required to keep your information. This is the principle of integrity and confidentiality, and this, I believe, speaks for itself, because it's very, very critical that any information that is kept about you should be confidential. This is not information that should be in the public domain and should only be accessible to individuals that either work within that organization or individuals that are necessary for them to either execute a contract or for any particular purpose that is directly related to what this company is offering you. And on the principle of accountability, the controller shall be responsible for and be able to demonstrate compliance with the data protection principle. So this just means that the accountability principle is basically a summation or a summary of all the other principles. That if you approach an organization and you ask them that, by the way, are you compliant with storage limitation? Have you ensured that my data is deleted from your systems once I am no longer either an employee or I am no longer contracted to you guys in terms of any service provision? So this would be some of the key principles. But in addition to this, one other principle that is also contained within Kenya's Data Protection Act is the principle that requires local entities not to transfer data outside the country unless other sets of conditions are met. And one of these conditions would be obviously consent. If you approach an individual and you collect their data and you tell them that, by the way, this data can be transferred outside the country because probably that's where the servers are contained, or in the alternative, a company should be able to show that there are adequate safeguards that are kept in place, which will ensure that this data is not susceptible to any breaches or to any accidental access. Yeah, I was just looking at the chat section. There are no questions thus far. Steve says, I hope you will share the slides. Yes, we will share the slides at the end of the presentation. Beyond the data protection principles, which are then sort of a guiding light as to how organizations should process your information, there is also the part that then directly interfaces with the data subject or with the individual from whom this data is collected. And these are what we refer to as the data subject's right. You as an individual or as a data subject have various rights under the Data Protection Act that you are at liberty to exercise whenever you feel perhaps your data is not being treated right, or in any other instances of the whole data protection landscape, whether it is with regards to an organization or with regards to an entity. And so one of those rights that you have is that you have the right to be informed. You have the right to be informed of how your data is or will be used, either collected directly from yourself or from a third party, because this sometimes happens that sometimes there might be various interplays between yourself, a third party, and a direct agency. A good example again would be the issue of insurance. So, for instance, you need to seek medical services from a hospital, and you are insured by a certain insurance company. The hospital, in that regard, would be a third party. So even if information is collected from this third party, then it is very, very necessary that they inform you why they are collecting your information. And the second right that you have is the right to access, so that whenever you want to access or you want to see or view any information that an entity or an organization has about you, then you are at liberty to do so. You also have the right to object to any processing, so that if you feel like these guys are processing your data unlawfully, maybe you are no longer an employee at a certain organization, you are no longer contracted to a particular company, and they're still processing your information, then you have the right to object. This also goes back to the issue of opting out of SMS marketing or email marketing, that they should give you the right to opt out or to unsubscribe from any unsolicited emails or messages that they've been sending you. So that is, in a way, you exercising your right to object the processing of your data. And then you also have the right to either rectify, block, or have any information that is false or misleading about you corrected. So again, this goes back to, we can think about the Access to Information Act and what we said it allows you to do in terms of having any false or misleading information corrected. Something else that is also very, very critical in terms of looking at the data protection landscape is data breaches and incident response. So you also need to understand what are data breaches and how is a company or how is an organization required to respond to incidences whenever there are instances of data breaches. And a good place to start would be understanding what a data breach is. And the Act, or the Data Protection Act, defines a data breach as any incident that leads to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, or alteration, unauthorized disclosure of, or access to personal data transmitted, stored, or otherwise processed. It's a fairly lengthy definition, but I think